Madison Harrison thought she buried her past the day she vanished in a fiery car crash. Darius Cole, her husband, mourned her, grieved her, and moved on, until 3 years later, when a routine photograph from a quiet town in Arizona revealed something impossible. Standing in the background, holding the hand of a young boy, was Madison, alive, under a new name, and living a life built entirely on lies. It was the kind of evening where the world seemed to move a little slower. Thick clouds rolled in over the Oregon hills, and the rain began to fall in soft, steady sheets, blurring the roads and dimming the streetlights. Michael Bennett sat on the couch in his quiet home, flipping through old vacation photos. The house had felt too still since Laura left that morning. She'd gone to visit a friend in another town, a 3-hour drive away. She was supposed to be back by dinner. But dinner came and went. No messages, no calls, just silence. Michael checked his phone again. Nothing. By 10 p.m., his unease turned into dread. Laura had always been cautious, especially when traveling alone. She would text if she were running late, call if something came up. This wasn't like her. When the phone finally rang at 11:13 p.m., Michael's heart leapt. But the number was unfamiliar. It wasn't Laura. It was the local sheriff's department. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and devastating. A vehicle registered to Laura had been found at the bottom of a ravine off a winding mountain road. The car was unrecognizable, burned so badly that it had melted the metal frame. A body was discovered inside. The officer didn't say much else, only that Michael should come down immediately. The drive to the crash site was a blur. Rain pelted the windshield, the wipers beating like a drum. Michael kept expecting to wake up from a nightmare. When he arrived, emergency lights cast eerie flashes over the charred remains of Laura's silver SUV. Smoke still lingered in the air, mixing with the scent of burnt rubber and fuel. The fire crew had already extinguished the flames, and investigators were carefully examining what was left. Michael wasn't allowed near the wreckage, but from a distance he saw enough. The car was crumpled beyond repair, folded around a tree as if it had been thrown with brutal force. The interior was blackened and skeletal. No one said the word death out loud, but the truth hung heavy in the silence. The days that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork, phone calls, and grief. The medical examiner's office confirmed what Michael feared. Dental records matched the body. It was Laura. There were no signs of foul play, no other vehicles involved. The conclusion was simple, clinical, and final. It had been an accident. They told Michael that Laura likely died on impact before the fire began. That was supposed to be a comfort. The funeral was small. Family, friends, co-workers, all of them in shock. Laura had been vibrant, full of life. She worked as a freelance graphic designer, loved gardening, and volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. She was known for her laugh, her stubborn optimism, and her carefully planned birthday parties. No one could understand how someone like her could be taken so suddenly, in such a violent way. Michael stood at her graveside in a daze. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast. He lowered the urn into the ground himself. That final act broke something inside him. For weeks afterward, he wandered through the house like a ghost. Her clothes were still in the closet. Her favorite coffee mug sat in the dishwasher. Her perfume lingered in the bathroom air. People tried to console him. They brought meals, offered to help with errands, sent messages full of kind words, but nothing touched the cold emptiness that had moved into his home. He replayed their last conversations in his mind, looking for anything unusual. Was she distracted? Had she seemed off? He remembered her smiling that morning, telling him she'd be back before dark. She never came back. Time, as people often say, began to dull the sharpness of grief. But it didn't erase it. Michael returned to work. He cleaned out her office. He gave away some of her things. He visited her grave every Sunday and brought fresh flowers. Life didn't return to normal. It just changed shape. 3 years passed, and still, not a day went by that he didn't think of her. Laura had been his anchor. They met in college, fell in love quickly, married within 2 years. They had dreams of starting a family, buying a little cabin near the mountains, traveling the world one day. Now all of that had turned to ashes. Some nights, Michael would wake from dreams that she was still alive, sometimes calling out to him, sometimes standing at the foot of the bed, with a strange expression on her face. He'd sit up drenched in sweat, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of old floorboards. He wondered if he was losing his mind. Everyone told him she was gone. The state issued a death certificate. The insurance company paid out the policy. He signed documents, spoke to officials, watched the body lowered into the ground. But something in him, some quiet, persistent whisper, never fully accepted it. Maybe it was the way the crash seemed too sudden, too final. Or maybe it was just the mind's refusal to let go of someone it had loved so deeply. Whatever it was, Michael kept that whisper locked away, hidden beneath logic and grief. He didn't talk about it. He didn't share it with anyone. It was just a flicker, a shadow in the back of his mind, until the day he saw her again, on a screen, in a crowd, alive. It was supposed to be just another quiet evening. Michael had returned from work, made himself a quick dinner, and turned on the television for background noise while he sorted through mail. His life had settled into a routine, predictable, silent, and painfully consistent. Grief had become a dull ache rather than a sharp wound. He didn't expect surprises anymore. He didn't want them. But surprises have a way of showing up when you least expect them. The local news was airing a segment about small-town festivals across the Southwest. It was one of those feel-good features, showing families enjoying food, music, and games. Michael watched without much interest, letting the images flicker across the screen. Children raced through fields of sunflowers, a band played country tunes on a makeshift stage, and food vendors served churros and lemonade from colorful stands. Then, in a wide shot of the fairgrounds, the camera panned across the crowd. Just for a second, maybe 2. A woman walked by in the background, holding a toddler in one arm and a drink in the other. Her face was only half turned to the camera, partially obscured by the brim of her sun hat. But it stopped Michael cold. He sat up straight, heart suddenly thumping in his chest. He replayed the footage, rewound, paused, stared. It was her. It couldn't be, but it was. The woman looked exactly like Laura. The same posture, the same way she tilted her head when walking, the same delicate curve of her mouth. It was impossible, absurd, but it wasn't just resemblance. It was her. Every inch of him told him so. He replayed the clip over and over, each time growing more certain. She wasn't alone. The toddler in her arms, maybe 2 years old, had soft brown curls and Laura's eyes. Michael's eyes. He stared at the screen for what felt like hours. The segment was filmed in Santa Mira, a small town in New Mexico, a place he'd never been, a place Laura had never mentioned. But there she was, or someone who looked just like her, moving through a crowd like she hadn't been buried 3 years ago. Michael didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind raced with 1,000 questions. Was it a coincidence? A cruel trick of light and shadow? Could someone look that much like her? But the longer he stared at the footage, the more he knew. It wasn't a mistake. Laura was alive. The next morning, he called the television station that aired the segment. At first, they gave him nothing, just vague information about where the footage was filmed and when. But with persistence and a carefully worded explanation, he managed to speak to someone in production. They confirmed the clip was filmed 2 weeks earlier during the Santa Mira Harvest Festival. Michael booked a flight that same afternoon. Flying into New Mexico felt like stepping into a dream. He had no plan, no contacts, no real evidence beyond a few seconds of video, and an overwhelming sense of certainty. But that was enough. It had to be. The town of Santa Mira was small. Population, barely 6,000. Nestled between desert hills and dusty farmland, it looked like the kind of place where nothing extraordinary ever happened. He rented a car and began to explore. He showed people still frames from the video, asking if they recognized the woman. Most shook their heads. Some thought they might have seen her. One waitress at a local diner paused a little too long when he asked, and then said she wasn't sure. That pause told him everything. Over the next few days, Michael returned to that diner, the Sunny Skillet, again and again. He sat at a corner booth, sipping coffee, and watching every customer who walked through the door. On the 3rd evening, just before sunset, he saw her. She came in carrying a tray of drinks from the back room, her hair pulled into a loose bun. She wore a faded t-shirt and jeans, simple, casual, but unmistakably her. She didn't look around nervously. She didn't act like someone in hiding. She laughed with a coworker, served a family of tourists, and cleaned a table with practiced ease. Michael watched her move, stunned. She looked healthy, alive, whole. She didn't look like someone who'd faked her own death and disappeared, but that's exactly what she had done. And she had a child. For the rest of the evening, he sat in his booth, barely touching his food, eyes locked on her. Questions flooded his mind. How had she done it? Why? Had she planned it all along? Was the crash real, or a setup from the beginning? He noticed her leaving through the back exit around 9 p.m. and followed at a safe distance. She walked a few blocks to a modest apartment complex, tucked behind a row of trees. She held the hand of the child, the same boy from the video. The mice walked inside, lights flickering on in the upstairs unit. He parked across the street and stared at the window until the lights went out. That night, he called a private investigator. He needed answers, not guesses. He needed facts, proof. The investigator moved quickly. Within days, he had her new name, Anna Whitmore. No criminal record, clean background, registered in Santa Mira for 2.5 years. She'd rented the same apartment since she arrived. The child was listed as her son. No father on record. No birth certificate from Oregon. Everything about her seemed new, too new. Michael turned the information over to authorities. He didn't know what would come next. All he knew was that his wife, the woman he had mourned and buried, was alive. She had vanished, changed her name, created a new identity, and started a new life in another state, with a child, and she had left him behind. Every moment of their marriage now felt like a puzzle he couldn't solve. Had it all been a lie? Had she ever really loved him? Or was he just a chapter in a story she had decided to close? Whatever the truth was, one thing had become clear. Laura Bennett never died in that car crash. And everything he believed for the last 3 years had just been turned upside down. Michael didn't sleep much during the nights that followed. He stayed in his rental car outside the apartment complex, sometimes for hours, just watching the lights flick on and off in the unit upstairs. Watching her walk the boy to the bus stop in the mornings. Watching her lock the door when she left for work. He kept track of everything, what time she left, when she returned, who visited, what stores she went to. It was as if the more he observed, the more he could make sense of the impossible. But nothing made sense. She was living a normal life, quiet, structured, stable. As though the years between her so-called death and now had never existed. Every day he watched her, the questions only multiplied. She had faked her death. That much was undeniable. But why? And how? Who was the woman in the burned car? How had Laura, a graphic designer with no history of criminal behavior, pulled off something so elaborate and cruel? And then there was the child. A little boy who looked just enough like Michael to stir doubts he didn't want to face. The private investigator Michael hired had been in the game for nearly 3 decades, and even he was taken aback by the case. He dug into Anna Whitmore's new life and found paper trails that led nowhere. Her social security number had been issued 2.5 years ago in New Mexico. Her rental history, bank account, and employment records all started fresh from that point forward. It was as if she'd stepped into a new life overnight. The birth certificate for the child listed no father. The name given was Elias Whitmore. No prior records. No school history before Santa Mira. No digital footprint at all until they'd arrived. The investigator had questions of his own. Was Laura working with someone? Had she assumed a dead person's identity? Or had she created one from scratch? Michael didn't care about the method anymore. He wanted the truth. So he authorized DNA testing. Samples were collected quietly, an old coffee cup she threw out, a strand of hair from her brush. Something the investigator carefully retrieved. The same was done for the child, through a discarded juice box. A week later, the results arrived. The woman known as Anna Whitmore was indeed Laura Bennett. The DNA was conclusive. The child, Elias, was also confirmed to be biologically hers and Michael's. The bloodlines matched. There was no mistake. The news knocked the breath out of Michael. For 3 years he had mourned not only his wife, but also the future they never had. He believed they would never have children. He had accepted that loss along with every other piece of his shattered life. And now, out of nowhere, he had a son. A child he never knew existed. A child who had been conceived before, or perhaps shortly before, Laura vanished. Why had she kept it from him? Why had she run? Michael turned the information over to the local authorities. At first, they were skeptical, then stunned. The case was passed from officer to officer, all of them unsure what to make of it. There was no arrest. Not yet. They needed to investigate further. They needed to understand what they were looking at: fraud, abandonment, identity theft, or something darker. While they worked, Michael kept his distance. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed to know the full picture. The more the investigator uncovered, the stranger it became. In the months leading up to Laura's disappearance, her internet activity had changed. She began visiting forums and websites about escaping abusive relationships, starting over, disappearing without a trace. She purchased books about faking deaths, about new identities, about how to vanish. The clues had been there, hidden in the background of a life that had once seemed normal. To Michael, these discoveries were gut-wrenching. He never considered himself abusive. Controlling, maybe. Protective, definitely. But never dangerous. Still, the evidence painted a different story, at least from Laura's perspective. In emails retrieved from an old backup, she had written to someone under a pseudonym, describing a marriage she felt trapped in. She used words like smothered, watched, and powerless. The details were vague, but the message was clear. She had been planning her escape for a long time. Then came the most chilling revelation of all. The woman in the car, the one who was burned beyond recognition, she wasn't just a random stranger. Her name was Carla Ruiz, a transient woman with a history of drug addiction and mental health struggles. She had disappeared from a shelter weeks before the crash. Her family had filed a missing persons report, but no one had linked her to the crash site until now. Dental records had been manipulated. The body was too badly burned to provide clear answers at the time. Laura had orchestrated it all. Somehow, she had convinced Carla to get into her car. No one knew how. No one knew what happened next. Did Carla know what she was agreeing to? Was it a setup, an accident, or something even worse? Investigators reopened the case under a cloud of suspicion. Laura, now Anna, was brought in for questioning under a false pretense, a traffic violation used as an excuse to get her into the station. She didn't resist. She seemed calm, collected, even cooperative. She admitted nothing, but the weight of the truth was closing in fast. Michael watched from a distance as it all unfolded. He was torn between rage and heartbreak. The woman he had loved had lied to him in the most devastating way possible. She had stolen years from him, taken his child, pretended to be dead. And yet, seeing her again, seeing their son, made his chest ache with emotions too tangled to name. He didn't know what he wanted anymore. Justice, revenge, answers, or simply a chance to understand why. The case became more complicated by the day. Without a confession, prosecutors were unsure how to proceed. There were loopholes, ambiguities. Laura hadn't legally changed her name. She'd simply started using a new one. The insurance money was still in limbo, pending further investigation. And Carla Ruiz's death, possibly accidental, possibly not, was now the centerpiece of a case that felt more like a psychological thriller than real life. Michael stood on the edge of a truth he wasn't sure he wanted. His wife had not only faked her death, she had buried a part of him with it. And now she was back, a ghost turned flesh and blood, living in plain sight under a name that didn't belong to her, raising a son he never got to meet. The past wasn't behind him anymore. It had just walked back into his life, holding a child with his eyes and a name he'd never heard before. The courtroom was quiet as the judge read through the documents. No gavel, no raised voices, just the low hum of a ceiling fan and the soft shuffle of papers being passed between attorneys. Laura, still legally known as Laura Bennett, sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, expression unreadable. She looked composed, almost serene, as if she had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Michael sat a few rows behind her, watching from the gallery. He hadn't spoken to her, not since the discovery, not since the truth began to unravel. The district attorney had chosen not to pursue charges for murder. There wasn't enough evidence to prove intent. The body of Carla Ruiz had been found in Laura's car, but there were no witnesses, no confession, no forensic proof to show what had happened in those final moments. Laura claimed she had picked up Carla as a hitchhiker and that Carla had taken the car while Laura stepped away. She insisted she had no idea why Carla had crashed it or how the fire started. The story was shaky, full of holes, but it was difficult to disprove without concrete evidence. And the statute of limitations had expired on many of the lesser charges related to identity fraud. Instead, the court focused on the most verifiable crime, insurance fraud. After the crash, Michael had filed a claim on the joint life insurance policy, unaware it was all based on a lie. He had received a payout, which he had used to cover funeral expenses and pay off the mortgage. Now, technically, that made him an accessory to a fraudulent claim, even though he had no idea. The lawyers made it clear that Michael wouldn't face charges, but he would have to repay the money. That added insult to injury. Laura's attorney painted her as a desperate woman, trapped in an emotionally suffocating marriage. She hadn't planned to hurt anyone, he argued. She only wanted a fresh start for herself and her unborn child. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as the attorney described her alleged isolation, her feelings of powerlessness, and her fear that she would never be allowed to leave. Whether those feelings were grounded in reality or paranoia didn't seem to matter. Her narrative had power, and it planted doubt. Michael listened to it all with clenched fists. He hadn't been perfect, he knew that. He was structured, rigid, and sometimes difficult. But he had never raised his voice to her, never laid a hand on her, never tried to control her beyond wanting to know where she was and when she'd be home. Was that control? Was that fear? The court didn't care. In the absence of solid evidence, perception would fill in the blanks. In the end, Laura entered a plea deal. No prison time, 5 years of probation, a hefty fine, and a requirement to repay the insurance company. The court would allow her to retain custody of Elias. That was the part that hit Michael the hardest. He had only recently discovered the boy was his son, and now the law was about to place him back into the care of the woman who had hidden his existence for years, a woman who had once let the world believe she was dead. Michael filed for partial custody immediately. He wanted to be part of his son's life. He wanted the chance to know him, raise him, protect him. But Laura pushed back. Through her lawyer, she argued that introducing Michael now would disrupt the boy's stability. Elias didn't know who Michael was. To him, his father had never existed. She claimed it would be traumatic and confusing to force that kind of relationship on him. So suddenly, the court ordered a psychological evaluation. Experts would decide what was best for Elias. Until then, Michael was allowed supervised visitation. Once a week, 1 hour at a time, in the presence of a court-appointed monitor. It wasn't enough, not by a long shot, but it was a start. So, first time Michael saw Elias up close was in a small room with plastic chairs and brightly colored walls. The child entered holding Laura's hand, eyeing Michael with quiet curiosity. He didn't cry or cling. He just stared. Michael's heart felt like it might collapse under the weight of that gaze. Elias had his eyes, his smile, the same small dimple in his left cheek. They played with blocks. They colored pictures. Michael asked questions, simple ones about favorite animals and games. Elias answered shyly, voice barely above a whisper. He didn't seem frightened, just unsure. Michael wanted to reach out and hug him, to tell him the truth, but the monitor reminded him to keep things neutral. No revelations, no emotional overload. He complied, though every second felt like a battle. After the visit, Michael returned to his empty hotel room and stared at the ceiling for hours. How do you parent a child who doesn't know you exist? How do you reclaim years that were stolen? From you, outside the legal system, the story began to spread. News outlets picked it up. Headlines ran with bold, dramatic phrasing. Wife fakes death, lives in secret. Man discovers dead. Wife alive with son. Twisted tale of love, lies, and escape. Reporters called Michael non-stop. They wanted exclusive interviews, TV appearances, documentary rights. He turned them all down. He wasn't interested in spectacle. He just wanted the truth to stop feeling like a nightmare. Meanwhile, Laura lost her job. Her new identity had been publicized, and no one wanted to be associated with a woman accused of deception. She was forced to move out of her apartment and into temporary housing while the court finalized visitation terms. She still refused to admit guilt, maintaining that everything she did was out of fear and necessity. But the cracks had formed. People in Santa Mira, once friendly and supportive, began to distance themselves. Parents hesitated to let their children play with Elias. Employers turned away her applications. The life she had built so carefully was beginning to unravel. Michael watched from the sidelines, torn between anger and sorrow. He couldn't deny the damage she had done. She had lied. She had faked her death. She had stolen years from him, stolen the chance to hold his newborn son, to witness first steps and first words. But despite everything, he couldn't bring himself to hate her. Not fully. A part of him still saw the woman he had once loved, the woman who had sat across from him at the breakfast table and dreamed of a future. But the woman he remembered was gone, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. Now he was left to pick up the pieces, not just of a broken marriage, but of a life that had been paused, rewound, and rewritten without his consent. And somewhere in the middle of all that wreckage stood a little boy who deserved better than secrets and silence. Michael had a choice to make: keep fighting for custody or walk away from the wreckage entirely. He already knew what he would do. He wasn't letting his son go. The custody battle stretched over the next 6 months, filled with court dates, evaluations, and slow-moving paperwork. Michael attended every hearing, every mandated parenting session, every supervised visit with Elias. He showed up early and stayed late, determined to prove he was stable, reliable, and ready to be a father. It didn't matter that he'd only learned of his son's existence a few months earlier. It didn't matter that his entire world had been turned upside down. All that mattered now was Elias. The psychologist assigned to the case interviewed everyone: Michael, Laura, and eventually Elias himself. She visited their homes, observed the visits, and reviewed their history. Michael's past was clean, no criminal record, no signs of violence or abuse, just a grieving husband who had spent 3 years mourning someone who hadn't actually died. Laura's file, by contrast, raised more questions than answers. Her decision to fake her death and flee across state lines cast a long shadow. The psychologist noted that while Laura clearly loved her son, her choices were driven by fear, not reason. Her distrust of Michael, the secrecy, the deception, It all pointed to instability. Still, the psychologist urged caution. Elias was only 3 years old. He had known only one parent his entire life. Any sudden upheaval could damage his emotional well-being. The recommendation: gradual integration. Increase Michael's visitation time, transition to unsupervised visits, and eventually pursue shared custody, if Elias adjusted well. Laura resisted. She argued that Michael's presence disrupted their routine. She claimed the boy grew anxious before visits and had trouble sleeping afterward. Michael didn't believe her. He had seen Elias smile, laugh, reach for him without hesitation. The child was curious, not scared, cautious, but not distressed. As the case moved forward, the media attention faded. Other stories replaced it. New crimes, new scandals, new tragedies. But for Michael, the story never ended. Each week was another chapter, another piece of a life he had been locked out of. He rented a small home in Santa Mira to stay close, abandoning his old life in Oregon. His job let him work remotely. He lived alone, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel isolated. He had a purpose. His unsupervised visits with Elias began on a sunny Saturday in February. Laura dropped the boy off with barely a word, handing over a backpack full of snacks, toys, and a change of clothes. Michael watched her walk back to her car without looking back. It was a quiet rebellion, her refusal to acknowledge how much had changed. He took Elias to the park. They fed ducks, climbed on the jungle gym, and shared a peanut butter sandwich. The boy asked questions, simple ones about the world around him, and Michael answered with as much wonder as he could summon. He learned that Elias liked dinosaurs and jelly beans, that he hated loud noises, and that he loved bedtime stories, especially ones about space. At one point, Elias reached up, took Michael's hand, and held it without speaking. That one gesture undid Michael. In that tiny, quiet moment, something shifted. The wall between them began to crack. Over the next few months, Michael's time with Elias increased. They visited museums, went to puppet shows, planted a small garden in the backyard. The boy adapted quickly, eager for new experiences, and slowly he began to call Michael Dad. At first it was whispered, almost experimental. Then it became steady, confident, real. Laura remained distant. She didn't attend school functions if she knew Michael would be there. She never stayed long during drop-offs or pickups. When they did interact, it was through curt emails or brief texts. She hadn't apologized. She hadn't explained. She just existed on the periphery, a ghost of the woman he had once married. Afternoon, Michael received a letter, handwritten, from Laura. It was brief, only a few pages, but it changed everything. She wrote that she had never stopped loving him, but she had been afraid. Not of him, she said, but of herself. Afraid she would disappear into the life they had built together. Afraid she would wake up one day and realize she was no longer her own person. When she found out she was pregnant, that fear turned into panic. She didn't want to raise a child in a life that didn't feel like hers. The crash, the escape, the reinvention, it had all been a desperate grasp at freedom. And then, when it worked, when she found herself living in Santa Mira with a son who didn't ask questions, she convinced herself she had done the right thing. But seeing Michael again had shattered that illusion. Watching him with Elias proved to her that what she had taken was never hers to take alone. She hadn't just escaped. She had stolen a future, not just from Michael, but from their son. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't deserve it. She only hoped that someday Elias would understand. Michael sat with the letter for a long time. There were no accusations, no justifications, no shifting of blame, just regret and grief. He didn't reply. In the following weeks, something changed between them. Laura began attending school events again. She showed up to birthday parties, helped Elias with school projects, and stayed a little longer during pickups. Their conversations, once stiff and cold, grew warmer. They talked about Elias's health, his education, his future. Slowly, painfully, they started co-parenting like equals. There was no talk of reconciliation. That part of their story had ended. Too much had happened. Too many lines had been crossed. But there was a new story forming, one centered on the child they both loved. And somehow, that was enough. By the end of the year, the court granted shared custody. Elias would split his time between both homes. Michael had turned the spare bedroom into a space-themed paradise. Glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling, rocket ship bedsheets, and shelves full of picture books. On the first night Elias stayed over, Michael tucked him in, read 3 stories, and sat by his side until he fell asleep. It was quiet, peaceful, whole. Outside the bedroom window, the stars blinked in the night sky. Michael stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The silence in the house felt different now, not hollow but full of second chances, of healing, of new beginnings. His wife had died once. At least that's what he believed. But from the ashes of that lie came something real, something worth fighting for. Not a perfect ending, but a true one.